Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to recreate this stunning open from the TV show, The White Lotus in Apple Motion. If you're not familiar with The White Lotus, it is a wonderful TV show on HBO. It's got to be one of my favorite shows. We're in season 3 now. We're in Thailand, but you don't have to be a White Lotus fan to get a lot out of this tutorial. We're going to be talking about working in 3D space. We're going to be talking about creating shapes and customizing the style of them. And I'm even going to show you how to make some objects be affected by the 3D camera in Apple Motion and others like this text not. So we're going to cover a lot of ground, and I generated the artwork that we're going to be using in this project from Adobe Firefly, which is Adobe's generative AI engine. And these are the images I landed on. I've got this for the front tapestry look and this one for the background. Are they as good as the original artwork on the White Lotus? No, somebody very talented created that artwork, and this is generative AI, so it's really never going to stand up side by side with that artwork, but I think for what we're doing today, it's serviceable. And if you truly want to follow along with me today, you can join my Patreon or the higher tier of my channel memberships here on YouTube. All of my members get access to all of my working files in Apple Motion. Plus, I'm going to drop in this artwork as well, so you can truly follow right along. And I've got my iPad here because I want to be able to reference the original artwork as we do this exercise. Okay, guys, let's dive right in. And here are the settings for today's project. I made it 4K, even though the images from Adobe Firefly aren't quite 4K. I think it's going to be okay. The frame rate is 24 frames per second, and our project duration is 6 seconds. Let's open it up. Now, the first thing I want to do is create the shapes of the front and back curtains that we can see in this open. They kind of have these scalloped edges. So I'm going to reach for the Bezier tool at the bottom of the canvas, and I'm just going to draw one side of that top curtain. And you can make curved lines with the Bezier tool by clicking, holding down your mouse button and dragging, but I personally don't like to do it that way. I prefer to just make my straight line zigzags and go back and adjust the curves. I just feel like it gives me a little bit more control as I'm working, but that's just a personal preference. You can use the tool however you like. And so here is my shape. I'm going to head on over to the inspector. I'm going to enable the fill, disable the outline, and I'm going to go back and right click on each of my points and make them smooth. And as I do this, I'm going to be referencing the original artwork and trying to make it as similar as possible. And while I'm doing this, if you're not a White Lotus watcher, let me fill you in. It's a prestige social satire on HBO. And a social satire is the kind of show where a lot of the characters are unlikable. But what makes The White Lotus so cool is that there's always a bit of a mystery every season. There's a lot of laughs, a lot of drama, a lot of tension. It's just a great show. So we've got one half of our top curtain. When I look at the original artwork, I can see that it's actually really symmetrical. So what I'm going to do is right click on my Bezier and I'm going to duplicate it. And I'm going to rename these guys to keep me organized. And then I'm going to take that right side, and in the inspector under properties, I'm going to twirl down on rotation, and on the y-axis, I'm going to flip it 180 degrees. And then I'm going to move it on the X position. So we've got our symmetrical shapes, and I'm just going to grab this little edit point here, and I don't want there to be a divot at that top point. So I'm just going to make a few adjustments here. Okay, that looks great. I'm going to rename this entire group Top Curtain Bezier. Now I'm going to head on over to my Finder and grab my artwork for the curtains. And I'm going to drag it on top of my project pane so it creates a new group. And like I said, this isn't quite 4K. That's okay. I'm going to scale it up to fill the frame like so. And I want to do a little bit of color adjusting on this image because the image that Firefly generated is much brighter and more saturated than the original artwork. So at this point, I'm going to address that. So I'm going to head on up to filters, color, and grab the color adjustments. And I am just going to bring down the blacks on this and the exposure and dial down that saturation. Okay, so generally, to me, this feels more in line with the original artwork. And by the way, if you're watching this and you're like, that's really cool, I don't know how to use Apple Motion, or I've been playing around with it, but I don't really feel like I have a good handle on it, you might want to check out my course, Motion Launchpad. It is a perfect introduction to Apple Motion so that this tutorial and every other tutorial you watch on YouTube, whether it be mine or someone else's, will make a lot more sense. I'll link to Motion Launchpad down below. And now what I want to do is use the Bezier group we just created as an image mask for this pattern. So I'm going to right click in my project pane, select add image mask, and I'm going to drag the entire group into the mask source. And there we go. Now we've got our top curtain. But when I look at this, I notice that the original artwork does have this kind of like tapestry trim around the perimeter. And I would also like to recreate that. So here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to take my top curtain Bezier group and I'm going to right click and duplicate it. Okay. And I'm going to rename this group top curtain trim. Now I'm going to enable that group and I'm going to twirl up the original group here so we don't have to look at it. And what I'm going to do is select each of these Beziers. I'm going to disable the fill on them and enable the outline. And then I'm going to go up to shape style. And I want to give this kind of that tapestry rough edge feel that I see in the original artwork. So let's head down to fauna. And I'm going to select feathers. And now you can see we have more of that like frayed edge that we see in the original artwork, but it is very yellow. So I'm going to head on over to stroke and I'm going to color over stroke. Let's scroll down on this gradient and I'm going to just change the color of this gradient to be more of a gold so it feels more like it matches our tapestry. All right, I'm going to say I'm satisfied with that. Let's do the same for the right side of the top curtain. Again, I'm going to select that Bezier, disable the fill, enable the outline under shape style. We're going to make it a feather and we are going to head on over to stroke, color over stroke, and just sort of color pick from our original trim. Try to match those colors as best we can. Okay, and I think we've done it. So there we go. We've got our entire top curtain group, but our elements are actually in separate groups at this point. I want to get them all into one group. So I'm going to select this top curtain Bezier that we have disabled that we're using as our image mask, and I'm going to drop it into this group. I'm going to select the top curtain trim group. I'm going to drag it on top of this top group. And now you can see it's messed up the order of our image. And so I want to bring our Firefly generated tapestry on top of everything in that group. So the order of your layers definitely matters here. Now we've been brought back to normal. And I'm going to rename that group top curtain. Now let's draw our attention to the bottom element of this tapestry. In the original artwork, I can see that the scalloped shape is very similar to the top shape, but it's not exactly the same. So I am going to duplicate what we just did, but then I'm going to modify the Bezier shapes. So on this top curtain group, I'm going to right click and duplicate, and let's rename this bottom curtain. And I'm going to twirl up on the top curtain so we don't have to look at it, and I'm going to disable that entire group. In my bottom curtain group, I'm going to disable the tapestry and I'm actually going to delete the trim because we are going to have to start this from scratch. So I'm just going to cut that. Let's twirl down on the top curtain Bezier. I'm going to delete the right side of that Bezier and let's enable the left side. And we're going to have to enable the whole group so we can see. And I want to adjust the shape of this just a little bit so it does feel a little varied from the top edge of the tapestry. So select it on that shape in my project pane. I'm going to right click in the canvas and let's select edit points to bring back all of our little Bezier points. And I'm just going to move these points around a little bit just so it feels a little different. I'm going to rename this bottom curtain left. I'm going to right click and duplicate it. I'm going to rename the duplicate bottom curtain right. And just like we did before, I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees on the Y axis and reposition it on the X. And then I'm going to edit these points again, just to get rid of that little point here at the top, because in the original artwork, it's actually a rounded edge. All right, I'm going to call that good enough for now. Now I'm going to select the group that contains both of those shapes. I'm going to rename it. And I want to flip this so this is all at the bottom of the screen. So on the rotation, on the X axis, let's flip it 180 degrees. And then let's enable our tapestry. And there we have our bottom edge. Now remember, we also want to recreate that trim. So I'm going to right click, duplicate that Bezier group, select each shape, enable the outline, disable the fill, change it to the feathers, and color over stroke. And same exact thing for the other side. All right, let me twirl up on that group and enable the top version. And I'm gonna need to reorder these in my layers panel. So I'm gonna grab the top group and bring it above the bottom group, like so. There's gonna be a lot more to do with this, but for now, let's bring in our background image that's gonna set behind these two tapestries. I'm gonna drop this on top of my project pane. And let's scale it up. And now looking at the tapestry I ended up with and the one from the original artwork, some of the things I'm noticing are that while they both have red and blue in them, the blue on my AI generated tapestry is more toward the edge and not in the center. So the blue is really going to be covered by our curtains when we layer them on top of this background. So I'm just going to use the hue and saturation curves to bring more blue into this image. Now, if you don't know how to use the hue and saturation curves, I have a tutorial on all the color tools on my channel that I will link to down below. And that tutorial was done in Final Cut, but the tools in Motion are the same as the ones in Final Cut. All right, and from here, I'm also going to add the color adjustments to this image and just make a few final tweaks. I'm going to reduce the contrast and I'm also going to reduce the saturation a little bit. So now let's take this 2D image into 3D space. So I'm going to head up to the top of the frame and I'm going to add a camera and I'm going to switch this to 3D. And now I want to play with the position of all of these layers in 3D space. So when we reposition things on the x-axis, it's side to side, y is up and down, and z is forward and backward. So I want to keep this image we're looking at now toward the back. So I'm just going to leave it at a Z position of 0. So in the inspector, if I twirl down a position, you can see it's on 0. Let's move on to the bottom curtain. I want to bring this forward in space. So I'm going to change this Z value to 1000. And on the top curtain, I want to bring that even further forward. So let's make the Z position 1500. So we're finally starting to really get the look of the real White Lotus open. From here, I could play with maybe the X and Y positions and the scale of our top and bottom curtains. So I'm going to shrink the top curtain down a little bit. It does appear bigger now because we've brought it forward in Z space since we're now working in 3D. And the bottom curtain, I'm also going to shrink down so I see more of those shapes, and I'm going to bring it down in Y space. And because we're working in 3D space, you'll see these icons at the top of your canvas. I'm going to grab this one, hold down my mouse button, click and drag, and now you can see our project in 3D space. So you can see the depth that we've created by repositioning our layers on the Z-axis, okay? To reset our view, I'm just going to double click that icon again. All right, let's add some motion to this camera because if you look at the source material, the camera on the open is actually zooming in to these different layers. So let's select the camera in our project pane, head on up to behaviors. Under the camera behaviors, let's add the zoom in, zoom out behavior. I'm going to cue up my playhead to the beginning of the timeline and let's increase the zoom to like 0.4 and see how that feels in terms of speed. I think that feels a little fast. It feels faster than the open. I'm going to go even half that. Let's go to 0.2. Okay, that feels better. And then you'll also notice that the top and bottom curtains are moving in opposite directions as the camera moves in. So let's add some behaviors to those. On the top curtain under behaviors, let's go basic motion, motion path. By default, the motion path is going to go left to right on the screen, which is definitely not what we want. So I'm going to, in the inspector window, twirl down on control points. And you'll see 3 values here. The first one is X, the second one is Y, and the third one is Z. And so I don't want the curtain to move side to side. I want it to go up and down, which means that we need to change the Y value. I'm going to make the X value on 0.2 a value of 0, so we're not going side to side. And I'm going to raise the Y value. Let me cue up my playhead toward the end so I can see how high I'm going. I'm going to raise the Y value to, let's say, 45 points. Okay, that's good. Now I'm going to select the motion path in my project pane, right click, copy it, and paste it to the bottom curtain. And under the control points, I want this to go downward. So I'm going to make the Y position on 0.2 a negative value. Okay, yes, we've got the motion. Very good. Now let's add a light to this project. Because we're working in 3D space, I can add like a virtual light that is going to cast shadows on all of these layers. So let's head on up to the Add Object button, select Light. And in the inspector, I'm going to switch this from Point Light to Spotlight. So we've got this tiny little spotlight here. Under Properties, let's bring this forward in the Z position. Now remember, our furthest forward element was this top curtain, and I had it at a value of 1500. So we want to bring the light further than that. So yeah, I'm at like 3000 here. So everything's lit up. Now let's go back to the Light tab in our inspector and play with these values here. So first of all, I'm going to dial up the fall off. So there's kind of more of a gradual darkening around the perimeter. In addition, I'm looking at the source material and I'm noticing that around the top edge of the frame, it does appear to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to head back on over to Properties and I'm going to bring this light down in the Y position, more toward the bottom of the frame. Let's go back to the Light tab, and I want to change the cone angle and dial up the soft edge. And I'm going to play with that fall off a little bit more. And let's enable the shadows here by clicking this box. And you can see instantly I'm getting very harsh shadows on the background here and on the bottom curtain from the top curtain down in these corners. Do you see that? Let's reveal the shadows controls. And I'm going to dial up the softness and dial down the opacity so they're not such harsh shadows, but we're still getting a bit of depth. Now I'm also noticing everything is very in focus with this image. And when I look at the source material, I wouldn't say there's a lot of depth of field on this shot, but I think in our case, because of how busy our AI generated background is, I would like to add a little bit of depth of field because we are going to be adding text on top of this. So what we want to do is select the camera in our project pane, and you'll notice under the camera tab in the inspector, there's this line here for depth of field. We can reveal all of these settings. And if I change the depth of field, you're not seeing anything. That is because depth of field rendering is disabled by default in motion to help enhance performance. But if you do want to apply that depth of field, you have to do it manually, top right here under render. Check depth of field. And now you can see that when I adjust the depth of field blur, we can see that the objects in the foreground are getting more and more blurry. But as I run my playhead in the timeline, the background starts to get more blurry as well. That is because the camera is pushing forward with our zoom in behavior. So we want to make some adjustments to the focus offset here and the near focus and far focus. So I'm going to keep my playhead to about the middle point and try to find a happy medium between keeping the foreground in focus and blurring out the background just a little, because I really think the background is going to be what's making the text hard to read. All right, so I'm just going to play with these sliders until at midway in my animation, I feel like the foreground is pretty sharp still and the background is more blurry. All right, let's leave that there. Now let's draw attention to the text in the original artwork. So it fades on a little bit after this animation starts. So I'm going to select the text tool and I'm going to add my text in the center of the canvas. And I'm going to type in my text into this field. And you'll notice I don't see it in my canvas. That is because the text has landed in this top curtain group. I'm going to drag the text all the way to the top of my project pane. And under Properties, I'm going to bring it to the 0Z position. Let's go back to the text editor. I'm going to change the font to, I think you pronounce this Trahan Pro? Somebody tell me in the comments how you're supposed to pronounce this particular font. The text is also centered and reasonably large. I'm going to head on over to Properties and recenter it on the X position. And I'm going to bring it up in the frame. And let's look at the composition of this text because it is a little unusual. Now, Trahan Pro is an all caps font. And I'm noticing that the T in the W in white are the same size as the rest of the text. So I'm going to uncapitalize my text here. I'm also noticing that the L in Lotus is bigger and sits lower than the rest of the text. So if you want to change just certain characters in your text, you need to enable the transform glyph tool. So at the bottom left of my canvas, let's switch to the transform glyph tool. And then I'm going to just select the L in my text, and I'm going to check in the canvas and make sure my box is just around the L. And I'm going to enlarge that letter L, just eyeballing it based on the original source material. And then I'm going to bring down the baseline on that L because it sits lower than the rest of the text. I'm also noticing that the font for the word the is smaller. So I'm going to select all of that text again on the transform glyph tool, and I'm going to dial down the size of that text. And I'm also noticing that now I have a much bigger gap between my two lines than the original source material. So I'm going to cue up my cursor after the word the, and I'm going to dial down the line spacing. And then in general, it feels like all of the characters in the original artwork are more kerned out. So I'm going to select all of that text, and I'm just going to increase the tracking like so. And I think the word the is still too big. I'm going to bring that down more. Now, what you're probably noticing is that this text looks terrible. It's so soft focus. It's got these harsh shadows behind it. I don't know if you can see that, but it just does not look good. That is because this text is being affected by both the camera and the light that we applied to our project. But if you look at the original source material, you'll notice that as the camera in this animation zooms in, it does not affect the text whatsoever. And we can do that in motion. So what I want to do is draw my attention to the group that contains our text. And you'll see that it's got this little layered icon next to it. That indicates that this group is a 3D group, which means it's going to be affected by the 3D elements in our project, like the camera and the light. If we don't want that, and in this case we don't, we can just hit this icon to make the group 2D instead. And now our letters are bright white because they're not being affected by the light, and they are in sharp focus because they're not being affected by the depth of field on the camera. So now we just need to make some final adjustments to this text, and we are on our way to being done. The first thing I notice is that because this is so bright white, it doesn't quite match the original artwork. The original artwork text is kind of a cream color. So let's just select all of that text, head on over to Appearance, and try to eyeball how this should look. And I think that looks good. And then the text fades in and fades out in the original source material. So I'm going to trim up our text in the timeline by selecting the group, queuing up my playhead to where I think the text should start coming in, and hitting the I key to trim it. And I'm going to come down a little later in our timeline and hit O to trim it on that end. And then on the group, I'm going to go up to behaviors and add a fade in and fade out behavior. And I think I'm going to leave it on the default 20 frames. And there is our White Lotus inspired open. If there's any other shows that you want me to try to recreate the opens for, let me know down in the comments. I love hearing from you. Don't forget that if you want all of my working files for all of my motion projects you've ever seen me do on this channel, join my Patreon or the higher tier of my channel memberships here on YouTube. You guys, thanks for hanging out. Here's some other videos I really think you're gonna love. I'll see you again.